This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Malink. Here's Steve.
Thanks for joining me once again for my discussion with Heather Reams, the president of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. Heather has been an advocate for conservative, clean energy and climate solutions on Capitol Hill. Now, Heather, when it comes to cutting greenhouse gases and Biden's pledge to cut U.S. emissions at least in half by the end of the decade, you've said we need solutions that can be adopted as readily in India as in Indiana. Did you have any specifics in mind?
Yeah, and I've made that statement a number of times. I think the time that really stands out to me, I was testifying on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and I was a Republican witness. One of the things that us as Republicans have been talking about is what we do here in the United States is it's done more cleanly, more efficiently than anywhere else in the world, even our fossil fuels. And we need to be clear-headed about how policies will be adopted that come from the United States and how they'll be adopted in emerging economies. So when I say Indiana, what works here, needs to also be able to work in India particularly from a cost standpoint. The emerging economies and developing nations are going to be booming over the next 2 decades. And we're thinking about reducing emissions, but these economies are really coming online and industrializing like never before. So how are we going to reduce their emissions? So just because the United States can get to net zero by a certain date, what does that mean for India? What does that mean for Indonesia? What does that mean for a lot of other Southeast Asian countries, for instance? And there's a global part to global warming, right? It's very global. Mm-hmm. And so we need to think about how we can reduce emissions here in the United States, create that technology and export it to other parts of the world. And rarely do we see regulation that's exported. We usually see technology that's exported. Mm-hmm. So that's very much where my organization and where Republicans' mindset is. How are we going to make sure that the policies we're developing here, but allow the technologies that can be exported?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Heather, let's talk more about energy policy. As you mentioned, the Biden administration passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has some provisions for clean energy support within it. But my understanding is the much bigger opportunity is the Build Back Better bill, which has lost its forward momentum. Do you have eyes and ears on the status of that bill and whether it will reemerge in a form that Senator Manchin from West Virginia can support?
Yeah, that's the hot talk right now, right? Yeah, I think Build Back Better, as it's been, doesn't have a path forward. If you think about it, we have the elections, the midterms coming up in November. Thinking about early voting starts in, let's say, September, late September. And then we've got, the rest of the summer and where we are now in February. There's just not a lot of time to get something large like that passed that's so stalled. But climate continues to be a priority, particularly for the majority, so Democrats. And there are provisions in Build Back Better, particularly with regard to tax, that could be transformational. And I think we should see a package emerge focused on tax. It wouldn't necessarily go through a reconciliation process. It could, but it probably has a better chance getting through on a bipartisan basis because there are a number of members who are supportive of many of the tax provisions that, from 45Q to an ITC and PTC that are there. So I worry about the timeline, though. Regardless of the bipartisanship, I worry about the timeline, and if anything can get done before November. The odds don't feel good right now. And I'll also just talk about the oxygen in the room that's going to get sucked up when we start dealing with the Supreme Court nomination and hearings. It takes up a lot of oxygen in the room in Washington, D.C. So I'm just thinking timeline, it's tough. Now, on the other side of the election, we have lame duck. I think there's an opportunity to pass hopefully more than an extenders package that would be more robust. And that's where I'd see some potential action, if any will happen, will be after the election.
And when you say extender package, that pertains to the ITC, which for the benefit of our audience, it's an investment tax credit, or the PTC, the production tax credit, the former being for solar, the latter being for wind. You're thinking that the opportunity would be to do something more than just an extension of what's currently in place, but to put in place something that's more, I don't know, maybe bigger or more permanent?
Yes, because with extender packages at the end of the year, and it's not just energy. I mean, there's child tax credits. There's tax credits for a lot of different things. I think I looked at 6 pages of tax credits that will expire at the end of 2022. So there's a lot of work in Washington about getting those extended or trying to make them permanent. The tax provisions in Build Back Better, what was Build Back Better, are longer in duration, more like 5 and 10 years long, whereas an extenders package is typically a couple of years. So for market certainty in clean energy, we of course would want to see something closer to what's in the tax provisions in Build Back Better.
My understanding is you're agnostic on the idea of a carbon tax because you believe it's not politically viable. Can you give us your thoughts behind that?
Sure. There are a number of right-of-center groups that are working on a fee, carbon in a dividend, or carbon tax. And there's just not a lot of momentum on the right to embrace a carbon tax. And I think the letters TAX just don't do very well for Republicans in general. And there's a lot of work to do in reducing emissions. And if we're waiting for that perfect alignment when a bill could pass, like a carbon tax, we're really wasting a lot of other time we could be working on emissions reductions in so many other ways. So there are other groups that do that work, and we know them. We talk to them often, and I'm glad they're working on it. But there's just so much more we need to be doing.
So here's a potentially vexing question. Given Russia's possible invasion into Ukraine and the effect this is having and will have on oil and gas markets, how should anything you are proposing change going forward? Or does it make the argument that fossil fuels need to be rendered obsolete sooner than later so that they cannot be leveraged as geopolitical weapons anymore in the future?
Well, it's a loaded question. It needs to, right? It needs to be, I'll unpack it a little bit for you.
Okay.
CREST is an all the above organization. So while we support emissions reductions. And one thing that it's important to know is what we do here in the United States with our natural gas and LNG has a much lower carbon profile than it does from Russia. It's about 41% lower. So we're thinking if Europe just imported our LNG and did not take Russia's, we would reduce emissions significantly over the next 5 years. Significantly, because of just the profile of our natural gas as compared to Russia. I think we should be producing more here in the United States and removing that geopolitical challenge and dealing with Russia right there. I also think, though, we should be producing every kind of energy that we can and doing it as cleanly as possible right now, because it is frustrating to see the geopolitical strife because of oil. Or whatever the energy source is. And we have to be, there's more of it. There's more energy than we've ever had, particularly with the shale revolution in the United States. At one point, we were energy independent. Right now, we're doing imports. But it just goes to show how important it is to be energy independent and dealing with geopolitics. Russia and the Ukraine and, of course, Europe are learning really the hard way about not being able to be energy independent, at least as Europe, and what that means. They are involved in a terrible strife that I'm sure is rippling through the continent. Europe being all too familiar with wars and destroying their lands and people and cultures, and I think it's really unfortunate. We need to be thinking globally and bigger, and I think the United States can have a tremendously positive effect around the world because of our clean energy production.
What are your thoughts about the future of nuclear energy?
I'm pleased to see that nuclear energy is starting to make a comeback, particularly on the left. In the infrastructure package, the $6 billion to help preserve the existing fleet in the United States is really heartening. And to see that pass on a bipartisan basis is really heartening as well. I think continued investment in advanced and modular nuclear is particularly important. And we're seeing that also with our partners in France, doubling down on nuclear, also in the UK, building new nuclear. This is not our grandfather's nuclear plants that we can develop now. They're super efficient. They need less space. They can be, when they're online, can be deployed quickly. And, you're thinking about places like a disaster in Puerto Rico, for instance, and losing the grid. What would nuclear have done to help get people back online more quickly? And then same in remote areas, like in Alaska, when they're burning diesel fuels in remote areas, which is so inefficient, not good for the climate, for the air. So I think nuclear has a great pathway, but all boats should rise, or 1,000 blossoms, and allowing all the innovation that's happening in the United States continue. And again, exporting clean energy and clean energy technologies around the world is my belief is that the greatest, most effective way to reduce emissions globally.
Very good. So Heather, just on the personal side, you originally started your career on the Hill working with several lawmakers. When did you decide to make the switch to the lobbying side of things?
I've been more of a communications person, and over the years, you don't realize what you're doing, but you look back on your path and you see how clear it is. And I've been in a unique position of working across the aisle with Republicans and Democrats on a number of issues. And this issue of clean energy and climate, I was approached, I guess a little over 6 years ago now, about this position. I'm like, I'm not sure if this has a viable path, and climate change is tough for Republicans.
Yeah.
But my other thing that had happened though is I became a mom. And, becoming a parent changes your outlook, and watching my daughter grow up and thinking, I really do want the world to be a better place for her. How can I do that? And, climate change is an existential threat. And we're seeing it more and more every day, and in places we never thought it would happen. And in different ways we don't think about happening. I mean, massive flooding or droughts, for instance, are a big deal for our food, for our energy, that alone, much less just having a prosperous life. So I just decided to start engaging on this. Sure, let's do it. And as I started building into this work in climate change, realizing that Republicans just need a different approach on dealing with it. It's been a wrong messenger and a wrong message for too long. And what they really needed is, conservative organizations to come alongside them and work with them about what they think, how they think they should be solving the problems. And that goes back to that individualizing meeting members where they are. I will say this is the most rewarding work I think I've ever done. So it's pretty exciting.
Yes. Well, gosh, I just want to concur that what you're doing is so important. We've got to get the conservative Republicans on board with taking action on climate change. And so thanks for all you're doing in that regard. Your personal story is very inspirational, and I hope to be hearing more about your work in the near and longer term. So thanks so much for joining my podcast, Heather, and I wish you all the best going forward.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Same here.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Malink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.